Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Port Harcourt liked to shine even in the rain, as if the downpour were only a veil a proud bride lifted each morning before stepping onto ABA Road with her chin up, and the Hart home on the quiet ridge above GRA gleamed brightest of all, a house so glassy you could count your heartbeat in its windows. Melvin grew up there like a plant in a greenhouse, every draft managed, every shadow named, taught to hold a fork as neatly as a pen, and to hold his tongue even neater, because words, his mother said, were the kind of arrows that remembered the archer. The compound smelled of wet hibiscus after storms, of lemon polish on the stair rails, of old money hiding in new furniture. The staff moved softly, the generators hummed like bees, and the river's breath carried salt into the curtains. His father's portrait watched from the hallway, stern as a judge from Benin City, and the rules of the house were read to him as faithfully as psalms. Wake early, look people in the eye without giving away your mind. Learn the price of diesel and the cost of a broken promise. Greet with 2 hands in the village and 1 hand in the boardroom. Evelyn Hart delivered these rules with a smile that cut like a new razor. Marry a woman who knows the price of pepper, she'd say, voice low as bad weather, because marriage is not Accra. You don't test it with 1 finger. In Lagos during school holidays, he learned that traffic could choke a dream, and that patience was the only canoe that crossed certain waters. In Abuja, he saw marble floors that refused to admit dust and men who spoke in figures as if numbers were charms. In Ibadan, an old professor told him wisdom moved like a tortoise but always arrived. The boy collected phrases the way other children collected stamps. He dressed like a treaty. He learned to make room for deals and little else. If the world were a market, his mother taught, then every smile had change in it, and if the herd was moving, you either knew the grass or you followed the tails. The city, with its oil-flushed bravado and damp evenings, cooed to him like a lullaby. He grew tall, tidy, and watchful, a young man who understood that a name could open more doors than a key, and that the door you opened might own you if you weren't careful. When rain battered the compound gates and the night guard brushed the drops from his cap, Melvin would stand by the balcony and think of maps. Lines between cities like strings drawing him outward, places where his mother's voice would sound far away enough to be memory. He didn't become rich, he simply continued it, like a second stanza holding the rhyme of the first, and if people in Port Harcourt whispered silver spoon, he learned to stir tea with it so quietly you would think it was wood. Apprenticed to numbers, married to schedules, he grew fluent in the coughs of boardrooms, in the way men from Kaduna shook hands like they were testing timber, in the way women from Uyo read a balance sheet as if it were an autobiography. He kept his desk clean enough to serve rice from, and his calendar packed tight as Ojalegba buses on a Friday. He traveled early and returned late, collected hotel soaps he didn't need, and folded his suits as if apology lived in their creases. When a deal in Abuja looked like rain in Harmattan, too good to be true, he'd open his umbrella halfway, a man who believed caution was the cousin of wisdom. Yet underneath the collar that always sat straight, a boy still mapped the world in tidy lines that assumed roads would stay faithful. He shook off invitations as one shakes water from an umbrella, and smiled the way a careful host smiles at a guest who may stay too long. He had friends who were really colleagues and colleagues who wanted to be cousins. The phone never slept. And always, as daylight folded its wrappers, his mother's sayings returned like a bell calling pupils. Marry a woman who knows the price of pepper. He met those women in curated living rooms in Ikoyi where the wine poured itself and laughter wore high heels. He met their parents whose names walked ahead of them like outriders. He learned to listen for the rustle of pedigree, the way one listens for a generator stalling. When he made trips to Kano, Jos, and Enugu, he wrote reports in neat columns and measured outcomes in decimal points, convinced that life, if properly tallied, would balance. But markets have moods, and fate, like a Danfo driver, swerves when you're not holding the rail. On a night flight above Owerri, lightning stitched the sky and the aircraft wobbled like a thought. Melvin looked down at the dark quilt of the land and felt a flicker. Nothing grand, only the sense that a man can know every proverb and still miss the sentence meant for him. Evelyn, meanwhile, wore tradition the way some women wear perfume. Not loud, but lingering. She kept a ledger in her head for every favor and an altar in her heart for every fear. She had seen men in starched caftans turn families into slogans and had decided her house would not be a headline. In the morning she walked her garden, cut roses as if harvesting red vowels, and reminded her son that money and marriage were two goats on one rope, always threatening to tangle. If you choose, choose well, she'd say, slicing fruit with the efficiency of a verdict. A bad wife will eat your sleep and drink your name, and a careless husband will make a market of his home. She admired women from Amwahia, who could turn 100 naira into 5 bowls of soup without blinking, and distrusted laughter that forgot its roots. She had a soft spot for Enugu's hills, and a hard eye for soft men. When family friends brought their daughters to Sunday lunch, girls with accents polished in London and ankles jingling with travel, Evelyn watched Melvin's face the way a seer watches smoke, measuring not only his charm but his drift. She did not nag, she arranged, which is a subtler tyranny. If he balked, she sighed, "No be today we start to count the cost," and the discussion closed like a book shut on a fly. Her love was a bridge with tolls. Still at night, when the compound exhaled and the housekeeper's radio sang a sleepy highlife from Calabar, Evelyn would sit by the window and think of her own first years with Melvin's father, a man who had worn his ambition like a borrowed coat, fine, but never quite fitting. She would not say it aloud, but her son's neatness worried her. Men who believe life is a spreadsheet forget that people are wind. She wanted for him a wife who could hold the house when trouble came banging like debt collectors, a woman whose good morning tasted of pepper soup and spine. The day he said he was traveling again, Kano for 3 days, perhaps 5, she only nodded and pressed a small Bible into his palm. "Remember," she said, voice dry, "when the road is quiet, it is planning its potholes." So he went, because movement had become his second religion, and the road, like a griot, kept telling him new stories. He counted airports the way bean sellers count change, fast, sure eyes everywhere, and by the time he learned the faces at MMA by heart, he could find his gate by the smell of coffee alone. Abuja greeted him with guarded boulevards and the hiss of sprinklers. Kano welcomed him with air that felt older than maps, and a market that spoke in spices and handshakes. On the drive from Malam Aminu Kano International, the sky stretched wide as a promise, and the old city walls kept their counsel. He checked into a modest hotel near Sabangari because the company accountant, a man from Ilorin who pinched naira as if they might scream, insisted the rates were friendly. Melvin didn't mind. A smaller lobby meant fewer eyes, and he liked to eavesdrop on cities one couch at a time. He read his notes, drafted emails, and watched the ceiling fan move like a lazy sermon. The receptionist wore a red scarf that looked like a small flame at a vigil. He noticed it the way a traveler notices a landmark, without meaning to, and then meaning to. Outside, the evening folded itself into call to prayer and generator rattle. Inside, his phone buzzed with Port Harcourt's habits. He turned it face down and listened to the building breathe. If life is a river, he told himself, then this was only another bend, another bridge, another checklist. Yet even a careful swimmer can feel when a current changes its mind. The market's hush after closing sounded like someone waiting. A laugh from the corridor ran down the tiles like water. He stood, smoothed his shirt, and thought of the rules that had carried him this far, the proverbs polished by his mother's tongue, the neat grids of deals and dinners. Somewhere between Lagos and Kano, a line had smudged. He couldn't name it. He only knew the night felt like a question, and for once he did not hurry to answer. The lobby light in the hotel near Sabangari had a tired glow, like a lantern that had seen too many nights, and Melvin, who had spent most of his life under chandeliers and polished bulbs, found himself strangely at ease beneath it. The receptionist with the red scarf was there, her head slightly tilted as she listened to a guest complain about the heat. She did not interrupt, she let him finish, then replied in a voice that had both patience and finality, promising to send someone up. When she turned to Melvin, her eyes were steady, without the flicker of curiosity or deference he often saw in others when they recognized his name. He was just another man checking in. That anonymity had its own taste, like palm wine before the first sour note. She wrote his name in the ledger slowly, as though giving it weight, and when she handed him the key card, her fingers did not brush his by accident or design. She simply did her work and moved on to the next person. That night, after the day's meetings had been wrestled into contracts and his laptop closed with the firmness of a banker sealing a vault, Melvin found himself downstairs again. He told himself it was for tea, but he lingered in the empty lobby, watching her stack receipts. They spoke, first about the weather, which in Kano could be as dry as a forgotten bone, then about the old city walls he had not yet seen. She told him of the market where spices lived in sacks taller than a man, of a street where the suya smoke curled like a beckoning hand, of an old bookstore hidden behind a tailor's shop. He listened longer than he meant to. Her name was Grace Holloway, a name that sounded as if it had been kept safe somewhere before being given to her. She mentioned her choir at church, how sometimes they sang in Hausa, sometimes in English, sometimes in both, so that the words felt doubled and whole. When she laughed, it wasn't with the brittle cheer of someone trying to please. It was low, like a drum you could feel in your chest. He remembered his mother's counsel and felt, for the first time, how far Port Harcourt was from here. Not in miles, but in the way a heart could shift when it met something unexpected. The second night came as if drawn by habit, though he had never planned it. He finished dinner, a plate of tuo shinkafa and Mayan kukka recommended by a local client, then drifted to the lobby where Grace was arranging flowers in a chipped vase. He asked if she always worked the night shift, and she told him she preferred it. The quiet hours, the slower pace, the way she could read without interruption between check-ins. She had a small book tucked beside the counter, its spine broken from use. They spoke of literature, of Chinua Achebe's measured sentences, and the way Ben Okri's words felt like dreams walking. She asked about his travels, and he found himself telling her about places he had been without ever really arriving, cities where he had gone from airport to meeting to hotel without learning the name of a single street. She listened without judgment, then asked, "Doesn't that feel like counting coins without knowing their worth?" The question startled him in its simplicity. They drifted to lighter topics, the stubbornness of harmattan dust, the best time to buy mangoes, the skill of women in Onitsha market who could calculate change faster than calculators. Every so often, a guest would interrupt to ask for towels or directions, and Grace would slip into her work mode, efficient and composed, before returning to their conversation without losing the thread. Time moved differently here. There was no need to fill every silence. Some of them were comfortable, like shade on a hot day. When he finally went up to his room, he realized he had not checked his phone for hours. In a life measured by schedules and alerts, that was no small thing. By the third evening, the air outside had cooled, and a faint smell of roasted maize drifted in from the street. Melvin arrived in the lobby with a question that had been tugging at him all day. If someone wanted to really see Kano, where would they start? Grace didn't answer right away. She studied him as if weighing whether the question was genuine or just polite curiosity. Then she smiled and began to describe a route, not the kind found in guidebooks, but one known to people who had walked the same streets since childhood. She spoke of Kofar Matadai pits, where men still worked with colors as if the centuries had not moved on, and of Dala Hill at sunrise, when the city stretched itself awake. She mentioned a tea cellar near the Emir's palace who brewed it strong enough to steady any heart, and a small stall by the roadside where fried masa came hot and soft, best eaten with honey. Melvin felt something loosen in him as she spoke, a thread untangling. This was not just geography, it was a map of belonging. When she asked if he would be in town long enough to see these places, he hesitated. His trips were usually quick, transactional. But he heard himself say, "Maybe I'll extend my stay." She nodded as though she had expected no other answer. That night, as he lay in bed, he realized that her presence was not loud or dazzling, but it had a pull, like the tide, subtle, constant, hard to resist once you felt it. The fourth night was unplanned. A client dinner had ended earlier than expected, and instead of returning to his room, Melvin wandered to the lobby again. Grace was there, head bent over her ledger, red scarf pooling around her neck. She looked up and smiled in greeting, not surprise. They talked until the clock above the reception desk seemed to tick only for itself. At one point, she spoke about her family in Jos, how her father had passed years ago, and how her mother still sang in the church choir despite her age. They were a family bound by faith, she said, and when life storms came, and they always did, their first instinct was to pray, then act. He told her about Port Harcourt in the rainy season, the way the streets flooded until children swam in them, and she laughed at the image. They were two people from different worlds, yet in those hours, the distance shrank. When he finally asked if she had ever been to Port Harcourt, she shook her head, but said she had an aunt there who sold fabrics in Mile 1 Market. It was a small link, but it felt like a bridge. By the time he returned to his room, his decision was made without him naming it. He would see her again, not just in passing, not just as the woman at the desk. And when he left Kano 2 days later, with her phone number written neatly in his notebook, it was not just another city checked off his list. It was the beginning of a story he did not yet understand but could feel moving, slow and sure, like a river changing course. When Melvin returned to Port Harcourt from Kano, The days were heavy with the smell of wet earth, and the clouds lingered like guests reluctant to leave. His mother noticed he was quieter than usual, more measured in his responses, as though some conversation still trailed after him. He did not speak much about the trip, except to mention the contracts had gone well, but at night he would scroll through his phone with a look she couldn't name. In the weeks that followed, messages passed between him and Grace, first cautiously, then with a frequency that startled him. She sent pictures of the market stalls draped in fabrics the color of ripe plantain, of the mosque's minarets against a sky so wide it made you feel smaller, of steaming bowls of tuo she claimed were worth a pilgrimage. He sent her glimpses of his own city, boats on the Bonny River, the oil terminals lit up like small suns at night, the unruly traffic of ABA Road. It wasn't long before he invited her to visit, and though she hesitated, the arrangement was made. When she arrived in Port Harcourt, the air was thick and restless, and Melvin, unused to being nervous, found his palms damp as he waited at the terminal. She stepped out into the crowd with her red scarf tied neatly, a small bag in one hand. They spent that first weekend walking along the water, visiting the market where the traders called out greetings in a dozen accents, and sharing meals at small spots where the pepper soup was hot enough to make the eyes sting. By the time she returned to Kano, they had crossed some unspoken line between acquaintance and something far more binding. It was in one of those late-night calls, when the rest of the city was folded in sleep, that she told him she was pregnant. Her voice was steady, but there was a pause after the words, a pause that seemed to wait for him to decide whether this news was a bridge or a wall. He promised to come and speak to her family, because she said plainly, "We do things in the open. My people will expect you." The meeting in Jos with her family was nothing like the business negotiations Melvin was used to. There was no boardroom table, no papers waiting for signatures, only the hum of conversation in the sitting room, the smell of a goosey soup drifting from the kitchen, and the eyes of relatives who wanted to know what kind of man had come for their daughter. Grace's mother greeted him warmly but firmly, her handshake lingering long enough to measure his grip, her eyes holding his without flinching. Uncles asked questions about his work, his people, his intentions. Aunties asked if he understood what it meant to marry into a Christian family that prayed together and bore each other's burdens. He answered carefully, aware that every word would be weighed and remembered. The conversation moved between laughter and solemn moments, stories about family history, warnings about the storms of life, assurances about the importance of keeping one's word. When it came time to discuss the bride price, it was not treated as a transaction, but as a ritual, a weaving together of two households. Melvin paid it without argument, not out of extravagance, but out of respect for what it meant to Grace's people. The evening ended with prayers, her family's voices rising in harmonies that seemed to press against the very walls of the house, asking for strength, for wisdom, for a marriage that would not scatter at the first sign of trouble. On the journey back to Port Harcourt, the road stretched long, and he sat in the car thinking about how easily one's life could shift. His mother had always imagined he would marry a woman whose family was as wealthy as theirs, whose upbringing mirrored his own. Yet here he was, tied now to a woman whose strength lay in things that could not be tallied on a balance sheet. He did not know how to tell Evelyn, but he knew delaying would make it worse. When he finally told his mother, the air in the Hart living room felt charged, as though the house itself was listening. Evelyn listened to the end without interrupting, her face a mask of calm that did not soften when he explained about the pregnancy, the family in Jos, the bride price already paid. She did not raise her voice, but each word landed with precision. She reminded him of her warnings, of the careful matches she had arranged for him to consider, of the importance of aligning households that understood the same measures of value. Yet there was something in her tone, perhaps resignation, that told him she knew the decision had already been made. The wedding, when it came, was a modest one compared to the kind of spectacle the Harts could have staged. It was held in a church in Port Harcourt, with Grace's family filling the pews alongside a scattering of Melvin's business associates. There was music, the kind that lifted the corners of the mouth without asking, and prayers that lingered long after the last amen. The reception was simple: jollof rice fragrant with bay leaves, fried plantain, bottles of malt and soft drinks passed around until the tables were crowded. There were no newspaper photographers, no mention in the society pages, only the quiet knowledge that two lives had been bound together in full view of those who mattered to them. They moved into a modest house in GRA, the kind of place with just enough space to feel open but small enough to know every corner. A lemon tree in a clay pot sat by the front steps, a gift from one of Grace's uncles, who said it would remind them that good things take time. In the first months of marriage, the days settled into a rhythm that was new for both of them. Grace adjusted to life in Port Harcourt, learning its streets, its markets, its moods. She made friends with the neighbors, women who would knock on her door with bowls of soup or stop her in the compound to chat about the price of Gary. She joined the local church choir, her voice blending easily into the familiar hymns. Melvin continued to travel for work, Abuja for a week, then Lagos, then Accra, each trip stretching just a little longer than the last. When he was home, they would walk in the evenings, sometimes in silence, sometimes trading stories about their days. When he was away, they spoke on the phone every night at first, but over time the calls became shorter, the gaps between them longer. Grace spent her days tending to the house, cooking, and, as the months passed, preparing for the arrival of their child. When Theo was born, the world seemed to contract to the small circle of his needs: feeding, changing, holding, soothing. Grace's days became filled with the soft chaos of caring for a newborn, and Melvin's visits home became moments of brief calm in a sea of motion. He would stand at the doorway of the nursery, watching mother and son, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes before he set down his bag. Sometimes he would promise that the travel would ease, that the business would stabilize, that he would be home more often. She wanted to believe him, but the lemon tree outside reminded her daily that growth could not be rushed, and some promises were slower to ripen than others. The marriage didn't crack with thunder. It thinned like old raffia, strand by strand, until one evening the rope slipped. Melvin's voice came through from Victoria Island with that Lagos hum that never sleeps, smooth as glass and twice as cold. He said the union was not working, those two words polished by distance, as if airports had sanded off their guilt. Grace sat at the dining table in their quiet corner of GRA Port Harcourt, the lemon tree knocking the window like a polite guest, Theo tracing circles on scrap paper, and let the sentence land without chasing it. Noise adds smoke, truth prefers clean air. She told him that decisions should walk in daylight, not under the table. He took that as permission to continue and spoke of timelines, of keeping things amicable, of paperwork that would make their lives tidier, the way a man describes a roof he doesn't plan to sleep under. When the line went dead, the room felt like it had learned a new draft. She drank water that suddenly tasted of iron and heard the city beyond the gate, Okadas hissing like annoyed cats, a hawker bargaining in pidgin, a preacher somewhere warning that midnight is the devil's office hours. She didn't cry. Tears are a kind of rain, and this wasn't a day for flooding. Instead, she reached for a ruled notebook, the kind schoolchildren carry, and began to build herself a small ark of lists. Title documents, bank accounts, clinic records, rent receipts, birth certificate, school forms. She opened Melvin's travel-stained laptop and found a life arranged like a party tray. Vendors booked for an Abuja hall with extravagant lighting, caterers chosen with the pomp of a coronation, an email thread titled New Beginnings that read like confetti thrown in advance. The strangest thing was not what she saw but what she didn't. No photographs of quiet mornings in Port Harcourt, no evidence of the strawberry-scented lotion Theo poured too generously, no trace that a house can be a heartbeat. She felt the ache of that absence like a missing tooth her tongue kept seeking. Still, a woman who knows the price of pepper doesn't measure life by pictures, she measures by proof. Paper doesn't forget, her mother always said, and paper doesn't argue. So she stacked the proof into tidy piles, bills in one, bank statements in another, scanned emails in a third, and slid them into a brown envelope whose corners softened under her palm, as if growing ears for the listening ahead. The night became a long corridor. At one end, her son slept with a soldier's seriousness. At the other, the future waited, tapping its foot. Morning put on overalls. Grace walked Theo to the nursery school with his small backpack bumping cheerfully behind him, then doubled back with a resolve that fit like a second skin. She phoned a quiet man from church, a lawyer named Caro based near ABA Road, whose voice always sounded like a river after the rains, steady, practical, uninterested in drama. He arrived the next day in a brown suit that remembered better days and listened as she laid out the pieces. He didn't chase adjectives, he asked for dates, documents, and details, and his pen made notes like measured footsteps. When she mentioned an email about using the house as collateral, he asked to see the bank file. They went together to the branch, where the air-conditioned air smelled faintly of wet envelopes. A customer service officer tried formal reluctance. Caro answered with crisp letterhead, and the charm of protocols obeyed in public. The file came. Inside, facility papers with the GRA address, A spousal consent she'd never signed, the signature close enough to flirt with truth and far enough to betray it. Grace's mouth dried. Forgery travels in borrowed shoes. This one had left footprints. Caro tapped the page with a calm finger. "We'll apply for an interim injunction," he said, "and report the forgery with minimal noise. You don't pull a yam by the leaves." He drafted with the patience of a mason, brick by brick, a motion to restrain any transfer or encumbrance, a supporting affidavit attaching the suspect consent, a schedule of exhibits labeled with the neat cruelty of facts. Meanwhile, Grace printed the gaudy New Beginnings flyer and the vendor emails that strutted like peacocks, because vanity, she knew, often doubles as evidence. They spoke of strategy the way farmers speak of rain: timing, volume, runoff. Caro advised silence until filings were stamped, advised against public quarrel that would feed gossip, advised breath measured like a tailor's tape. She agreed. When she left the bank, the sun over Diobu had climbed to the unforgiving part of the day, and the city glittered with the kind of heat that makes quarrels cheap. She bought sachet water, said thank you twice to the woman who gave it, and walked home feeling the new weight of her envelope, a quiet anvil tucked under her arm. Evenings learned a different rhythm in those weeks, a drumbeat too slow for dancing and too steady to ignore. Grace cooked simply, because a child should taste stability, even if the house is learning the grammar of war. Theo tugged at her wrapper and asked when Daddy would come. She said Tuesdays and some Saturdays and made a game of counting them, not to hide reality, but to give it a shape a small boy could carry. Her mother called from Joss and prayed in that plateau cadence that turns worry into warm cloth. Women from church knocked without appointment, dropped bowls of okra soup, and sat for 10 minutes speaking around the matter the way rain circles a roof before it chooses a leak. At night, when the neighborhood choirs of generators tuned up, some bass, some treble, none melodious, she arranged documents on the table like chess pieces and rehearsed answers for the questions men in wigs might later ask. She learned to read law not as thunder but as weather, sometimes blinding, sometimes merciful, always indifferent to tears. In the lonelier moments, small things hurt with sharp edges: a cufflink under the couch, a half-washed coffee mug, a text from a number with no name saying, "Hope you're good." At such times she would step outside, breathe the damp air, and watch the lemon tree hold its small green planets, unhurried. Kano had taught her the patience of dye, the way cloth sits in the pit until color agrees to live there. She began to hum hymns in a lower register, notes that didn't ask to be admired. Caro checked in like a metronome. Filings lodged, registry stamp expected, service being arranged. He ended each call with "We move when the hour moves," and she found peace in the shared silence that followed, the kind that says we are not wasting words. She also learned the economies of attention, which messages to ignore, which calls to return, which conversations to postpone until paper had finished speaking. If fear tried to sell her a story at midnight, she would remind it that dawn is stubborn. She was not hunting vengeance, she was building a fence. The difference matters. The missing lever presented itself like an old proverb remembered at the pot's final stir. Over Sunday rice at the Hart House months earlier, Evelyn had mentioned family instruments, with the bored grace of someone discussing upholstery. The word returned now, bright as a coin found in dust. Grace rang the Hilltop compound and asked for time. When the gate opened days later, the guard looked from Theo's car seat to her face and nodded in that respectful Port Harcourt way that says the ground knows your footsteps. Evelyn received her in a parlor where beeswax and roses had signed a treaty. It was not a court, yet the air held witness. Grace laid her brown envelope on the glass table, like someone placing a child for dedication, and spoke with the restraint of a woman who wants results, not applause. An attempted lien on a shared home, a signature that was nearly hers, event plans in Abuja dressed as freedom, a draft separation that had balance in only one direction. She did not describe Melvin as a monster. She described conduct that put a roof at risk and a child in a storm. Evelyn listened with that unblinking patience rich women learn in boardrooms, fingers worrying a silk handkerchief as if testing its truth. When the reading ended, she stood, crossed to a cabinet that had likely swallowed secrets for decades, and removed a slim folder sealed with red wax. "This trust is older than some mistakes," she said. "It carries a clause our lawyers called prophylactic and I called wicked until it saved us once. If a heart chooses divorce without cause before 7 years, trustees hold the keys for a long season. No votes, no distributions, no quick sales." She spoke as someone ashamed of both the need and the usefulness. Grace exhaled, not triumph, not relief, something quieter, a confirmation that the ground beneath her was not conspiracy but earth. "I don't want the house to burn," she said. "I want the doors locked against midnight sellers, and I want Theo's name to sit where nobody sweeps." Evelyn nodded once, then again, the second nod heavier. "We will tip the trustees, not the town crier," she replied. "Let him arrive at his party and learn that rain respects no suit. You, my dear, keep your records dry and your prayers simple. When men need a marriage like dough, sometimes the oven must be turned off." And with that, two women who hadn't chosen each other agreed to row the same canoe until the river calmed, each understanding that victory tastes better when it doesn't leave ash on a child's tongue. By the time the harmattan wind began to sandpaper the streets of Abuja, the plan had been drawn in quiet ink. Evelyn's call to the trustees was not a dramatic announcement, but a deliberate whisper into the right ears, the kind of whisper that moves faster than shouting, because it carries the weight of discretion. In an office tucked behind the bustle of Central Business District, 3 trustees sat at a polished table the color of dried cola nut and examined the evidence she had delivered. The event flyer for the New Beginnings party, the draft divorce documents, and the absence of any grounds beyond convenience. In the world of high finance, trust clauses are like sleeping crocodiles, rarely noticed until they open their eyes, and this one was hungry. The language was exact. Without proven cause, marital dissolution within the initial 7 years shall trigger immediate suspension of benefits and rights of disposition. The phrase had been drafted by a London solicitor with the detachment of a surgeon, and now, years later, it was about to draw blood without raising its voice. Grace had not been in the room for these deliberations, but she imagined them as she boiled rice in the GRA kitchen, picturing men in Ankara ties and women in understated jewelry discussing the fate of a man who still thought the party in Abuja would be a crown rather than a coffin for his plans. Caro updated her in his slow, methodical manner, confirming that the injunction on the house was holding. The forged consent was now part of the police file for potential prosecution, and the trustees had formally opened an event review under Clause 12b. She thanked him, not with the giddy relief of someone who thinks the battle is over, but with the sober nod of someone who knows wars are fought in skirmishes. The days that followed were filled with errands that masked the tension. School runs for Theo, shopping for palm oil in Mile 3 Market, choir rehearsals where she let her voice blend into harmonies without standing out. People in the neighborhood waved at her, without knowing she carried in her handbag the sort of paperwork that could change the slope of a man's life. At night, she would sit by the lemon tree with a cup of tea, thinking of how she had once prayed for peace in her marriage, and how now she prayed for justice without ruin, because ruin leaves rubble that children must climb over long after the war is done. Evelyn moved like someone playing ajedrez with her own bloodline, each gesture calculated not only for victory, but for what it would cost to win. She invited Grace to the hilltop house on a Thursday afternoon, the city below sweating under a cloudless sky, and laid out the next steps as plainly as one might explain market bargaining to a child. The trustees would send formal notice to Melvin's counsel once they had certified intent to divorce without cause. The injunction would be registered in Abuja to block any attempt at cross-jurisdictional filings. The forged consent would be quietly disclosed to a compliance officer in Hart Holdings, ensuring corporate whispers reached him before any court summons did. "He will understand before the party that this is not theater," Evelyn said, pouring Zobo into glasses as if this were just another visit. Grace listened, asking questions only to clarify timelines. She had learned that information is a kind of rope. You can either pull yourself forward with it or be tied in place. When they finished, they sat in the parlor for a while, watching a pair of hawks circle the ridge. Grace wondered aloud whether Melvin would simply retreat into stubbornness. Evelyn's eyes, sharp and unsentimental, stayed on the birds. "Pride will make him throw stones at his own roof," she said, "but roofs can be mended. What he cannot afford is to lose the house and the trust in one sweep. That will bring him to the table." The words were not cruel. They were the flat truth of someone who had lived too long among men who mistook patience for passivity. As Grace drove back to GRA, Theo asleep in the rear seat, she passed the city's restless markets and thought of how deals are made in Nigeria, not only with contracts, but with glances, silences, and the timing of when you arrive and when you leave. Timing was on her side now, and she intended to keep it. Caro had advised her to avoid confrontation until the trustee's letter was in Melvin's hands. "Don't give him a chance to spin a story before the paper speaks," he said, leaning forward in the small office they sometimes used as a meeting point in ABA Road. "A man can drown you in words before the facts arrive, and by then people will believe the splash was your fault." She followed his counsel. She kept her social visits light, her church attendance steady, her face unreadable to those who liked to feed on rumors. The neighborhood women noted her composure and, in the way of women, adjusted their own commentary. Without fresh scandal to season their talk, they shifted back to comparing stew recipes and fuel prices. Meanwhile, in Abuja, the party preparations continued. Hall reservations confirmed, caterers paid, a small army of event staff rehearsing the lighting for the man in white. Grace received updates from a cousin who worked in the capital and could blend into any gathering. "They think it's his fresh start," the cousin said over the phone, "but some people are already asking why they've not seen you." Grace smiled faintly, though no one could see it. "Let them ask," she replied. "Questions are the cheapest invitations." Her nights were spent reviewing the custody proposals Caro had drafted, balanced, enforceable, designed to give Theo stability without turning him into a pawn. She found herself reading them not as legal documents, but as maps for a future she could navigate without constant fear of detours. She signed where she needed to, left notes where she wanted clarity, and returned them promptly. Paperwork became a discipline, a way to measure the ground she had gained. It steadied her. The day the trustees' notice left their office, Abuja's sky was the color of dry maize, and the air carried the faint smell of dust and expectation. It was sent by courier to Melvin's counsel, copied to his personal email, and lodged in the official record of the Hart Family Trust. The language was as polite as a formal invitation and as final as a slammed door. Pending review of documented cause, all distributions and rights under the trust are suspended for the term prescribed under Clause 12b. There were no exclamation marks, no raised voices, just the cold comfort of legality. Evelyn called Grace that evening to confirm delivery. "He will know before the party," she said, "but whether he believes it is another matter. Men in white suits often think rain will not fall on them." Grace thanked her, and then went to the kitchen to prepare dinner, stirring the pot with a calm hand. Outside, the lemon tree held a single small fruit, not yet ready to pick. She thought of it as a reminder that outcomes, like fruit, ripen on their own schedule. Theo played in the parlor, his laughter folding into the sound of the evening news on the radio. Somewhere in Abuja, Melvin was reading words that would change the arithmetic of his plans, and she felt no triumph, only the even breath of someone who had kept her footing on a shifting floor. The next step would not be hers, it would be his. Whether he walked into the party as a man adjusting to a new reality, or as someone pretending the ground had not shifted, that would be his choice. She had done her part. Now the silence would work for her. The night in Abuja dressed itself like a chief, white lights, silver cutlery, a band that knew how to make even silence dance. And Melvin arrived the way people arrive when they think life owes them a standing ovation, his suit so white it made the chandeliers look lazy. The hall smelled of new money and old perfume, and the host's laughter moved from table to table like a politician shaking hands in election season. Outside, the wind from Javi Lake slipped through the doors each time a waiter passed, carrying the soft scent of water and diesel, and somewhere a generator coughed like an uncle clearing his throat to start a story. News of his new beginnings had already climbed every staircase. Abuja loves a spectacle the way Lagos loves traffic, and the invited came dressed to witness a man set fire to the bridge behind him. Melvin felt tall in the gaze of his guests, taller than the stage, taller than the trust letter his lawyer had forwarded with the subject line that tried to sound calm. Urgent, review attached. He had skimmed it, the way men skim danger when the music is sweet, and told himself the trustees were only making noise. After all, in his mind, trust clauses were like crocodiles, dead until you step too close. He clinked a glass for attention, smiling with all the teeth his father had paid a dentist to keep straight. Then the double doors opened with the old dignity of a courthouse, and the entire evening shifted as if someone had quietly tilted the floor. Grace stepped in wrapped in a deep red cloth that held the room like a held note, and beside her walked Theo, the little boy in neat shoes gripping her hand with the practiced seriousness of small children, who know their mothers mean what they say. Conversation stumbled. A waiter froze with a tray, one flute sliding until it steadied itself like a guilty thought. "A beg who be that?" someone whispered behind a fan. Another guest, wicked with curiosity, murmured, "The chapter he tried to tear out." Grace's eyes found Melvin's without hurry. No anger, no show. Just a woman who had chosen the path and was now walking it. If a goat chews too loud, the bush hears. Tonight, the bush was listening with 1,000 ears. He started to say her name, but the band's saxophonist, sensing something holier than music, faded into a respectful hush, and the microphones that had been warming themselves for a toast went cold as judgment. Grace reached the foot of the small stage and did not climb. She remained at ground level, as if to insist that whatever was about to be said belonged to earth, not theatrics. "Good evening," she said, and the syllables were clean, Lagos traffic-free, Port Harcourt oil-slick-free, the way water is when it has passed through many stones. "I won't keep you. I came because daylight is better than rumor. The house in GRA Port Harcourt is under injunction. It won't travel to serve plans it did not join to build. The forged consent has been lodged where such things go, and the trustees of your father's instrument have written you in the language that cannot dance. You can celebrate a beginning if you wish, but not with a pen that signs away a child's pillow." A ripple moved through the hall, the kind of ripple that runs across corn when the wind turns around. Melvin lowered his glass, then his shoulders, then his gaze. Evelyn, who had been standing near a column as if guarding it, stepped forward just enough to make her presence a sentence. She did not touch Grace, but Abuja saw the geometry. Two women aligned like surveyors measuring a boundary. "What is this?" a man in a tight tuxedo hissed to another, already composing new gossip. "It is what happens when paper grows teeth," the other replied, not looking away. The master of ceremonies, who had rehearsed jokes for a lighter room, held his card as if it were evidence and quietly left the stage. A woman from Maitama leaned toward her companion and whispered, "When the market burns, even the onions smell like praise." The lights, set earlier to flatter the white suit, found themselves kinder on red. The cloth drank the brightness without begging. Theo, who had been silent, tugged his mother's hand, and she bent, listened to his whisper, and nodded, the universal choreography of a parent saying, "I hear." When she looked up again, she faced the man in white and softened her voice by a notch. "There are terms," she said. "Not to humiliate you. To hold what is ours in both hands." She drew a plain envelope from her bag the way a farmer draws a yam from the mound. No show, just proof, and offered it across the short distance that can feel like a mile when pride is on foot. Inside lay a draft that Caro had scrubbed of loopholes. Shared custody with a calendar that respected school terms. A support schedule pegged to realities rather than promises. A clause that protected Theo's routines like a fence around a cassava farm. And the clean acknowledgement that neither party would turn the other into a rumor scaffold. "Read it," Grace said, not prompting a debate but assigning homework. "We can sign at a table where the pen does not shake." Melvin took the envelope with the care of someone accepting a delicate instrument he had never learned to play. His hands, which had known only the weight of ledgers and the heft of good cutlery, suddenly discovered paper could be heavier than iron. He glanced at Evelyn as if seeking a translation of what his eyes already knew. She did not rescue him with words. She only gave a small nod that said, "This is the cost of walking on a roof like it is ground." He remained silent long enough for the room to begin its natural gossip again, whispers slipping like lizards along walls, phones rising with the hunger of birds, but no one moved to laugh. When pride meets consequence, even Abuja remembers its manners. He gestured to the event planner, a man in black with a headset who had spent 2 weeks memorizing the evening's choreography, and the planner, reading the signal older than any schedule, dimmed the lights by a breath and told the staff to ease the music into nothing. In that quiet, Melvin found his voice, and it sounded like someone had opened a window in the harmattan, clean but colder than expected. "You could have burned me," he said, not accusing, almost surprised. "You chose a smaller fire." Grace did not smile. "Big fires eat the house," she replied. "Small ones cook the food." Somewhere deep in the hall, a chair creaked as if in agreement. He nodded, a short movement, then stepped down from the stage. If you want to know a man's direction, watch his feet, not his mouth. His shoes carried him to a table near the exit where the light was enough to read without turning the page into theater. He sat, opened the envelope with the decisive care of someone learning to fold humility, and began to read line by line, the way a pupil copies arithmetic until the numbers stop playing tricks. Outside, the city continued its endless bargaining with the night. Taxis haggled with passengers, sellers argued kindly with buyers, and the lake kept breathing as if nothing had happened in the hall up the road. Inside, consequences arranged themselves with housekeeper efficiency. Invitations were pocketed before they fell to the floor. A woman in sequins covered her mouth with her hand and finally exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath on someone else's behalf. The band leader packed his saxophone, knowing instinctively that any note tonight would be a wrong one. Evelyn moved not to comfort but to steady the edges. She retrieved her shawl from a chair, draped it over her arm like a verdict that had chosen not to shout, and stood within sight of her son but not within reach of his excuses. Grace squatted to tie Theo's shoelace, murmuring something that made the boy smile. She straightened and turned, her red cloth catching the air with a soft authority, and walked toward the doors. A few guests tried to intercept with questions shaped like concern, but she gave them nothing to carry home except the shape of her back and the calm in her step. Outside, the Abuja night had cooled, the black sky salted with stars as if the city had been given a new ceiling. She put a hand on her son's shoulder and felt the solid truth of him under cotton. When Evelyn joined them a moment later, they stood together not like conspirators, but like women who had survived the logic of a storm. "Tell me when he sings in church," Evelyn said, eyes on the parking lot where men in white shirts pretended to adjust cones. "I'll come quietly, sit at the back." Grace nodded. "We'll keep the windows open," she answered, an old Port Harcourt habit making itself into a promise. Weeks later, back in GRA, the lemon tree offered a single ripe fruit, small but perfect, the skin bright as a new idea. Melvin began to come on Tuesdays and some Saturdays, learned the taste of groundnuts at the park in D-Line, discovered that Theo counted kites by color and not by number, and that apologies sound most honest when they arrive as actions. Nothing turned into a fairy tale. Abuja does not hand out fairy tales, only chances. The trust suspension held like a well-built fence, and he learned to walk its perimeter without rattling it, understanding that some freedoms must wait their season. Grace returned to choir practice, sang alto with a voice that had found fresh gravel, and kept her records tidy not because she meant to wield them, but because memory, well stored, is a house with dry firewood. If the city ever asked what became of the man in white and the woman in red, the honest answer would be simple. They learned the slow art of living after the drum stops, where the true dance begins. My friends, life has a way of testing the strength of the walls we build. Sometimes the people we trust will try to move the foundation when we're not looking. When that happens, don't answer every storm with noise. Answer with wisdom, patience, and the kind of proof that speaks louder than any quarrel. Protect what matters, stand your ground without losing your dignity, and remember that silence used well can be a shield sharper than a sword. May your home never be a playground for betrayal. May the works of your hands be guarded from greedy fingers. May your children grow under a roof where love is firm and peace is constant. May no stranger write the story of your life without your permission. May wisdom sit in your heart like a trusted elder, guiding your every step. And when life tries to shake your foundation, may God give you the strength to stand and the grace to overcome. If you believe it, say aloud amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.